In this chapter, we'll be addressing the functions of the urinary system, as well as the anatomy of the kidney, how we form urine, and a little bit of information on urine and renal function tests, as well as discussion of urine storage and elimination. To live is to metabolize, and metabolism creates a variety of toxic waste products. Thus, they have to be removed by the body. The respiratory system, the digestive system, sweat glands, and the urinary system all have roles in removing these waste products from the body. However, the urinary system is the principal means of waste removal. The kidneys are compound tubular glands that separate metabolic wastes from the blood. The rest of the urinary system serves only for transport, storage, and elimination. But most of our focus in this chapter then will be on the kidneys and their function. The task goes far beyond just excretion. The kidneys are involved in regulating blood volume and blood pressure, regulating the erythrocyte count, blood gases, blood pH, as well as electrolyte and acid-base balance, which constitutes a whole nother chapter on its own. Now, the urinary system is closely associated with the reproductive system. Thus, it's often called the urogenital system. They share a common embryonic development, which is reflected in the adult anatomical relationship. In humans, the male urethra serves as a common passage for urine and sperm. The urinary system consists of 6 organs. There are 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, and the urethra. We'll spend most of our time looking at the kidneys. However, in the later portion of the chapter, we'll look at the transport system. So the kidney is involved in filtering blood plasma. It separates the waste from other useful chemicals and returns the useful substances to the blood while eliminating the waste. They regulate blood volume and pressure, either by eliminating or conserving water. They also regulate the osmolarity of the body fluids by controlling the relative amounts of water and solutes eliminated. The kidneys secrete an enzyme called renin, which activates a hormonal mechanism that controls blood pressure and electrolyte balance. They also secrete erythropoietin, which stimulates the production of red blood cells. And they collaborate with the lungs to regulate the partial pressure of CO2 and thus the acid-base balance of all the body fluids. In addition, the kidneys are involved in the final step of synthesizing the hormone calcitriol, which helps maintain calcium homeostasis. They're also involved in gluconeogenesis, in which glucose is made from amino acids during extreme starvation so that the brain can get enough energy to function. Now, nitrogenous wastes come in a variety of different forms. A waste is any substance that is useless to the body or present in excess of the body's needs. Metabolic waste are waste substances that are actually produced by the body. Thus, the food residue in feces is a waste product, but not a metabolic waste product, since it was not actually produced by the body, and indeed never really even entered the body's tissues. Among the most toxic of our metabolic wastes are small nitrogen-containing compounds called nitrogenous wastes. There are 4 classes of them. We've got ammonia, urea, uric acid, and creatinine. About 50% of the nitrogenous waste is urea. This is a byproduct of protein catabolism. When the proteins are broken down to amino acids and then the NH2 group is removed, it forms ammonia, which is extremely toxic. The liver quickly converts this to urea that's somewhat less toxic. The other nitrogenous wastes, like uric acid and creatine, are produced by catabolism as nucleic acids, as well as creatine phosphate. Although they're much less toxic than ammonia and less abundant than urea, they are far from harmless. The level of nitrogenous waste in the blood is typically expressed as blood urea nitrogen, or BUN. The normal concentration of blood urea is about 10 to 20 milligrams per deciliter. When BUN is elevated, it indicates renal insufficiency and is called azotemia. Nitrogenous waste can cause toxicity that will lead to diarrhea and vomiting, dyspnea, and cardiac arrhythmias. This condition is called uremia. Excretion is the process of separating wastes from body fluids and eliminating them. 4 body systems are involved in the process of excretion. The respiratory system excretes CO2, small amounts of other gases, as well as water. The integumentary system secretes water, inorganic salts, lactic acid, as well as urea in sweat. The digestive system secretes water, salts, carbon dioxide, lipids, bile pigments, cholesterol, other metabolic waste, as well as food residue. And the urinary system secretes many metabolic wastes, toxins, drugs, hormones, salts, hydrogen ions, as well as water. Now let's take a look at the anatomy of the kidney. First of all, its position, weight, and size. It lies against the posterior abdominal wall, about the level of thoracic vertebrae 12 down to about lumbar 3. The right kidney is slightly lower due to the large right lobe of the liver, and the 12th rib crosses the middle of the left kidney. The kidney is retroperitoneal. That means it's behind the peritoneal lining, along with its ureters, the urinary bladder, the renal artery and vein, and the adrenal glands. It's about the size of a bar of bath soap, and its lateral surface is convex. The medial is concave. It has a slit in it that's called the hilum. The hilum receives the renal nerves, the blood vessels, the lymphatics, and the ureter. There are 3 protective connective tissue coverings. There's the renal fascia, which is immediately deep to the parietal peritoneum, and it binds it to the abdominal wall. Just inside that is this perirenal fat capsule. As you'll see when we dissect, there's an immense amount of fat that surrounds each kidney in its pocket behind the peritoneum. It protects it and holds it in place. Then directly on the kidney's surface, we see the fibrous capsule. It encloses the kidney and protects it from trauma and infection. There are collagen fibers that cross from the renal fascia into the fibrous capsule. These collagen fibers, as well as each of the protective capsules, will hold the kidneys fairly tightly in place. However, when we go from lying down to standing up, we'll still see movement of about 3 centimeters. The renal parenchyma, or the glandular tissue, is the functional tissue of the kidney, and it forms the urine. It's all here. It appears in a C-shaped section and encircles this renal sinus. The renal sinus contains blood and lymphatic vessels, nerves, and urine collecting structures. There's adipose, or fat cells, that fill the remaining cavity and hold all these structures in place. So lots of adipose tissue around here. There are 2 zones in the renal parenchyma. There's the cortex and the medulla. As with many other structures, the cortex is on the outside. The medulla is deeper. There are renal columns, which are extensions of the cortex that project inward towards the sinus. And there are usually about 6 to 10 renal pyramids. These are the darker areas here. They're sort of in a pyramid shape. Their broad base faces the cortex, and then the renal papilla, or point, on the bottom faces the sinus. It's almost like a little nipple that drips urine into the sinus. Each renal pyramid and its overlying context constitutes a lobe of the kidney. Now, as the pyramids drip their urine into this sinus area, they're collected first by the minor calyx. This is the one that first contacts the papilla at the end of the pyramid. The minor calyces converge and form major calyces, and the major calyces converge to form the renal pelvis. This renal pelvis then dumps into the ureter, which is a tubular continuation that drains the urine down to the urinary bladder. Here's a cartoon version. Sometimes these can be much more clear and help you understand the arrangement of the kidney. Again, each of these renal pyramids has a papilla on the end which drips urine into the minor calyx. The minor calyces join the major calyces and then into the renal pelvis and the ureter. The cortex is on the outside. The medulla is this pyramid tissue. You'll see the renal columns in between each renal pyramid. And each renal pyramid, as well as its overlaying cortex, constitutes a lobe of the kidney. So being as the kidney is filtering the blood, there's a fair amount of circulation in the kidney. The kidneys account for only about 0.4% of the total body weight, but they receive about 21% of the cardiac output. That's considered the renal fraction, 21%. So we must have a lot of vasculature to get it there. When the blood enters the kidney, the renal artery divides into segmental arteries. The segmental arteries then give rise each to interlobar arteries. The interlobar arteries move up the renal columns between the pyramids. And then, as they curve up and over the pyramids, they're called arcuate arteries. And from each of the arcuate arteries stem multiple interlobular arteries. So interlobar go between the pyramids, interlobular move through the cortex. These interlobular arteries then divide into afferent arterioles, and the afferent arterioles supply one nephron each. Inside the capsule of the nephron, we can see that there's a whole ball of capillaries. This ball of capillaries is called the glomerulus. Blood is drained from the glomerulus by the efferent arterioles, the veins, and then that will lead to either peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta around the portion of the renal tubule. Those will lead to either a bed of peritubular capillaries that surround the tubules of the nephrons, or the vasa recta that surrounds a portion of the renal tubule called the nephron loop. Or it could be transported by the interlobular veins directly back into the arcuate veins and then the interlobar veins and back to the renal artery. This is a great figure to summarize the blood supply to the kidneys. We can see the arterial side. We can see the capillary beds surrounding various portions of the nephron, which we'll introduce soon, and then the venous side returning blood to the heart. So we can look a little closer now in the cortex at these peritubular capillaries. The peritubular capillaries branch off of those efferent arterioles, and they supply the tissue near the glomerulus, as well as the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. In the medulla, the efferent arterioles give rise to the vasa recta, which supplies the nephron loop portion of the nephron. So this would be a great time to spend a moment diagramming the anatomy of the kidney, including the cortex and the medulla and the pyramids and all the components of the renal pelvis, as well as the blood supply in the kidney. So now that we have an understanding of the general anatomy of the kidney, as well as its circulation, it's time to look at the nephron. The nephron is where the actual function of the kidney goes on. Each kidney has about 1.2 million nephrons, so these things are tiny. They're each composed of two principal parts. The renal corpuscle, which you can see in the figure here, that filters the blood plasma, and the renal tubule, which is a long coiled tube that converts the filtrate into urine. To understand how just one of these works is to understand nearly everything about the kidney. So guess what? Yes, there will be some diagramming of the nephron. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule that encloses the glomerulus. We introduced the glomerulus before. That was the ball of arterial blood supply inside the renal corpuscle. The capsule itself is made of simple squamous epithelium. This is this very outer layer. The visceral inner layer of the Bowman's capsule consists of these elaborate cells called podocytes. They wrap around the capillaries in the glomerulus and help create the filtration system. The capsular space separates the two layers of the Bowman's capsule. It comes across as somewhat of a C shape. There's a vascular pole, that's the side of the corpuscle where the afferent or arterial blood enters the corpuscle, and the efferent arteriole leaves. Then there's the urinary pole. That's the opposite side of the corpuscle where the renal tubule begins. When we take a closer look at this capsule, we can see the glomerulus in the center and the capsule, Bowman's capsule, around the outside. The glomerular filtrate, after passing the podocytes, collects in this capsular space and then follows this proximal convoluted tubule. You'll notice that the afferent arteriole is much larger than the efferent arteriole that carries blood away. The reason for this will become clear as we progress. After urine leaves the renal corpuscle, it goes into the renal tubule or the uriniferous tubule, which is a duct that leads away from the glomerular capsule and ends at the tip of the medullary pyramids. It's divided into 4 regions. There's the proximal convoluted tubule, this region here that is closest to the renal corpuscle. The nephron loop here, the distal convoluted tubule, and the distal convoluted tubule after the nephron loop. And finally, the collecting duct. The collecting duct receives fluid from many different nephrons. So the proximal convoluted tubule arises from the glomerular capsule. It's the longest and most coiled region. In this figure, it's been simplified. It's composed of simple cuboidal epithelium with prominent microvilli, which increase the surface area. So this is the area where we see the majority of absorption happening. The nephron loop is also known as the loop of Henle. This is the long U-shaped portion of the renal tubule. It has a descending limb and an ascending limb. There are thick segments and thin segments. The thick segments have simple cuboidal epithelium, like the initial part of the descending limb and part of the ascending limb. They're heavily engaged in the active transport of salts, and many of them actually have their own mitochondria. The thin segment is made of simple squamous epithelium. It forms the lower portion of the descending limb, and its cells are very permeable to water. These differences in structure are imperative to the functioning of the kidney, as we'll see in later sections of this lecture. Now, the distal convoluted tubule begins shortly after the ascending limb re-enters the cortex. It's shorter and less convoluted than the proximal convoluted tubule. It's got cuboidal epithelium, but no microvilli. Less absorption is occurring here. This is the end of the nephron proper. The distal convoluted tubule then dumps into the collecting duct. The collecting duct receives fluid from several different nephrons as it passes back into the medulla of the kidney. Numerous collecting ducts converge towards the tip of each pyramid to form the papillary duct. 30 or so different papillary ducts end at the tip of each papilla. The collecting and papillary ducts are lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. So let's step out just a little bit and see how one of these nephrons might possibly fit into the relationship of the medulla and cortex. Fluid first comes in to the glomerular capsule in the cortex here, into the proximal convoluted tubule, down into the nephron loop, into the distal convoluted tubule, to the collecting duct, to the papillary duct, then into the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, the ureter, the urinary bladder, and then out as urine through the urethra. Spend a moment here and diagram yourself a nephron. Just simply, each of these different parts. Take it from the glomerular capsule to the papillary ducts. Now, some of the nephrons are going to be mostly cortical, and some of them are going to pass into the medulla. 85% of all the nephrons remain purely in the cortex, as you see here, and have very short nephron loops. The efferent arterioles, that is the blood supplying the corpuscle, branch into peritubular capillaries around the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. The remaining 15% of the nephrons are juxtamedullary. That means they pass into the medulla. They're very long nephron loops. They maintain a salinity gradient in the medulla that helps us conserve water and not lose it all in the urine. Their efferent arterioles branch and form the vasa recta, which is around the long nephron loop. Now, naturally, as with any other organ, the kidney is innervated. It's innervated by the renal plexus. The nerves and ganglia wrap around each renal artery and follows the branches of a renal artery into the parenchyma of the kidney, the functional tissue. And it sends out nerve fibers to the blood vessels and the convoluted tubules of the nephron. It's under the influence of sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. The sympathetic innervation comes from the abdominal aortic plexus. Stimulation will reduce glomerular blood flow and the rate of urine production. You think about it, fight or flight. Well, we're in the fight or flight place, and we don't need to be producing a lot of urine. They respond to falling blood pressure by stimulating the kidneys to secrete renin. This is an enzyme that activates hormonal mechanisms to restore blood pressure. The parasympathetic innervation arises from the vagus nerve and acts to increase the rate of urine production. Remember, parasympathetic, rest and digest. There's plenty of time for urine formation. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our first section on the urinary system. Make sure you spend some time putting together those diagrams. Go out into Anatomy and Physiology Revealed and review each of these structures in the cadaver. In the next section, we'll move on to the physiology of how urine is formed.